wording, eating on cultivating bodies. And my argument, so that you've had it in the beginning, so that the rest of the time you know what you're going towards, is that there is no such thing as a natural body, that bodies are cultivated all the way through. There is no such thing as nature, there is cultivation. And this goes for bodies and sensitivities. That's the main argument, that's put there in no natural, and this also then goes for the emotions. So you're talking about emotions and or something about affects in this conference. And what struck me reading around in emotional geography is that there's this fallback into the body as if that would be a natural category. And then some people say matter, as if we then know what that is. Let me be a bit fierce, we don't. And in life on Earth at the moment, there is no such thing as nature in the classic sense of what this word used to be. And if it is, it's certainly not the human body. And that's my main argument, and I'll add as an addition that this also has influence for the way we can do political and social theories, and that the cultivated body also generates new ideas, not necessarily in relation to what you're doing, because I saw many people are doing that kind of thing, but they're radically new in relation to traditional political theories, so they deserve to be articulated. That's it. If you've got it so far, you're nodding there, you can relax for the rest of the time. I'm not going to say much more. But I'm going to elaborate it. Now, the body. Here you see the body, and already you see that there are very different images. I use these images, of course, as an evocative tool to get a sense. You know that because you're in that kind of field. Good. The body is evoked by these entirely different images that do something different, want something different, come from somewhere different. You can see in the middle, I found my pictures mostly on the internet, you can see in the middle how anatomy tries to make the body universal at the moment, because classic anatomical images are dead white man, literally by the way. Although you can go on about who's the corpses, when and where, but a bit up-to-date anatomical atlas like this one shows bodies with different markers to show that anatomical body is everybody, but it isn't. Not because it's some people and not others, but because it's a body that is made and in that way under particular circumstances, and I'll go into that in the next slide. But in contrast, I want to point you here to a very different way of depicting the body, which is the dynamic one of physiology rather than the static one of anatomy, that does different things and asks different questions. So a body is always somewhere, and by that I do not mean my body is here and his body is sitting on that chair there. I also mean that an anatomical body, and you see that on the left image there, is something that has only emerged from the fact that there were such things as anatomists that were going to cut in corpses. Now, all of that is not obvious. You have to have a corpse and you have to be able to cut it in, and it has to be like, you couldn't do that if it was so warm that the corpse would rot very early. So you can see that in the history of anatomy that they would cut corpses in the winter in the northern hemisphere, where it's cold enough to actually not work on your corpse for a few days. So anatomy has all that kind of history. So there is not such thing as that body given. There is that history of cutting, and it's actually very weird that, let's say, the icon of the way of body images that spreads up images of dead bodies. The other image you see here is typically linked up with the physiological body, and this is a person who is measuring, who has a little measurement machine, because the physiological body comes with ups and downs of all kind of, in this case, hemoglobin levels. So this doesn't matter for today, but you could have a higher hemoglobin level or a lower. And this is a woman in India who has suddenly a machine in which she could measure her own hemoglobin. Now, that is a very different practice of attending to or relating to a body than cutting a corpse. So for a start, already there is no such thing as the body, because different ways of knowing bodies are part of very different practices, both knowledge practices, as the anatomy, and practices that have a specific kind of goal. Like, why would you want to measure your hemoglobin level? That is tied up with the fact that it could be low, that it can be measured, and that there might be something to do about it. Now, if we say bodies are always situated somewhere, that is a nice geographical sentence, because this where question is by tradition, shared, by the way, by anatomy and geography. What kind of ways can we think about places? Now, that again is not a natural something. And I have here two very different ways of making a place. The first one, this is a nursing home, and I pull that up, preparing food in a nursing home, as a typical sort of ethnographic way of imagining a place. This is somewhere, this is at a table in a nursing home. And if you give your ethnographic fieldwork description, you could start with an image like that if you happen to have done your ethnography there. You can do it with any equivalent ethnographic place, which is a very different way of making place or of imagining space. As the grandiose world map there, that has been designed originally for trade and war purposes. I mean, that's where it comes from in the history of map making. So that is a very different way of making space. Now, anatomy and geography both share in their history, and there have been very interesting studies of how they mapped the earth and the human body in quite analogous ways and trading knowledge and techniques from one to the other. They share what you could call Euclidean space. That means you have an x-axis and a y-axis, and you project points on them, and that is the way you imagine space. You've had all this in your first, I mean, at least the Earth one you've had in your first geography class, but you can now easily imagine that body space is done in more or less similar ways. There are a few, you see there are a few more nice lines, and they all have good Latin names. Now, there are lots of representations around, as you also must be aware of, and I use the known together to the unknown, that mess up Euclidean space. First, I want to talk with you about the anatomical figure here eating an apple. Now, that messes up everything I've said so far. That's why I love this picture, because anatomical images or anatomical figures cannot eat an apple because they're corpses. And it's typical that anatomical knowledge and eating do not coexist in the same reality, because anatomical knowledge is after eating. It's when eating is over. Well, for the human at least, there's other creatures who might start eating, but they don't eat apples, they eat humans. And the map I use there is a typical product of creative geography, where this is a map that represents the amount of kilocalories per head eaten in a specific country. So what you see there is not equidistance or equisurface, it's equicalorie per person. So that the United States, no surprise, or Australia look big, and there is nothing much left of India or the middle part of Africa. Those kind of representations also remind us that other ways of space making depend on x-axes and equivalents within them. Now, there are more ways to mess up Euclidean space, and one of them that I'll go into for a bit is the practice of eating and drinking. And they come, if you really trace practices of eating and drinking, they come with quite complex spatial configurations. Now you can see here these two children nicely making a mess of it. And already in that image, you see that where the food starts and the body begins, or vice versa, is not very clear. But that is not only the case that we make a mess of it. It is what is going on with eating. The outside and the inside change places. Like if here the bami in the case of the first child, and whatever it is, the vegetable stuff in the case of the second child, are in their bowls at first, at least half of them will be in their bodies in the end. And I take some graphic, nice biomat images for you to make that clear. The upper one I also like, because there is this juxtaposition of a sort of real human being, and then this blown up graphic image of what is supposed to be the bowel lining, where you see this underneath there's the bowel lining. This is the very moment where the outside is supposed to change into the inside. What is very interesting, by the way, where is the outside and where is the inside? In the case of the children, you say here their food is in the bowel. Once they've swallowed it, I would say it's in the inside. And in the practice, let's say, of parenting, that is the moment you think, it's in the inside. But for physiologists, it's not yet in the inside, it's in the bowel tract. And this is where a physiologist would localize the boundary between the outside and the inside on the bowel lining. So what is the outside and the inside can shift depending on the practice and depending on the kind of concern of the outside and inside. But what was food before becomes inside later on, and only partially so. As you know, some parts of the things that we put in our mouth leave our bodies without going through our bloodstream, but they depart more directly from the bowels. What you see, the other image there is a schematic image of a kidney. So that what kidneys are doing is constantly making inside outside. So what has been inside gets partly filtered in the kidney and put to the outside again. So the kind of boundaries we have to do here are fascinatingly interesting, so-called semi-permeable boundaries. Some things pass through and other things do not pass through. So it's not all fluid and happy and everything flows. It's a complex process in which things are incorporated or excorporated. That is in itself fascinating, but that gets relevant again in different practices, and that also offers interesting images for other sites and situations. Now, in the background of, how to say this, so-called universal body images emerge in two places. One in this icon of the anatomical body, and other one in the so-called my body of phenomenology. There is this whole phenomenology tends to work with with my body, and then suppose that my body is an icon, that is a universal figure. It's actually profoundly weird, I think. So let's talk about my body. And then I literally mean my body. Just to have a piece of a body. Now in the middle, you see my body. You see that image is an image of my body. I see some puzzled looks, I'm happy to say, because then I mean, this is stuff from my cupboard. And since I made the photo, I've all eaten and digested that. But that means that if you start to ask the question, where is my body? It is not just here in Groningen talking to you in the Offer House room. There's all kind of the rest of the world folded into it. Now I went onto the internet to make you a nice image of people in Costa Rica harvesting pineapples. I can't guarantee that that's the exact pineapple that I've been eating. I haven't done a good track and trace, but some of your geography colleagues make these beautiful track and traces of the way products at the moment travel on Earth. But the implication of that for body theory is that Costa Rica and bits of it, in a sort of first physical sense, are folded into my body. I have eaten these kind of pineapples, so there is a bit of the Costa Rica soil, Costa Rica water, and the labor of the people who have been working on the pineapples, and the labor of the people who have been working on the ships, and etc. and so on, folded into this my body. On the other hand, you see people in Thailand making rice. As you see there, I had proper good organic Thai rice. Yeah, citizen. But of course that means that in Thailand they have been making my rice. And one of the more fascinating things is that in Thailand they know I like rice. So hey, I mean you can put it like that. And that's a new way of writing global markets, as how interesting that the farmers in Thailand know that I like rice. And then I mean, it's the same story, but folded and differently. Now, think on about that later. I've got more to say, which is that it's not just that stuff from elsewhere is in my body, messing up traditional ways of Euclidean location. It's also then that my so-called senses are spread out. It's not that my touch is only in my hand and my taste is only in my mouth. That way of imagining to what the body, or even my body, is way too simple. That's another Costa Rica images. Those are people working in a banana plantation, cleaning bananas. So what are they doing? They're sort of, if you could have sort of an imaginary case where individual bodies would sense out whether something is edible or whether it's poison or whether it has bugs or not. I don't have to sense that. If I buy my banana from the Albert Heijn, which is the Sainsbury's, I mean, this is the generic sort of shop where people like me would buy bananas, then I don't first have to sniff and measure and see whether it's good or not. That has been done for me. My senses have worked in Costa Rica. Likewise, in all the commodity chains, there are endless moments of inspection that are done by people in laboratories that do our senses for us, or not our. I mean, I shouldn't say our. This is not done for everybody on Earth. It certainly is done for my body. But that also means there is another link to that, which is that the way bodies get shaped and their senses get shaped. So partly, maybe there are two faults. Partly is the senses are elsewhere. The other thing is that the senses that are in here get shaped in very complex ways under current global conditions. So there is not just stuff from elsewhere, but also styles that move over the earth. And I have a few iconic images here. One is from somebody selling nice French little baguettes in Hanoi, because the Vietnamese threw out the French in '54. Actually, they won a great colonial victory. They had to do some more stuff after that, but never mind. So they threw out the French, but they kept the bread. For good reasons, it's nice bread, and they locally they liked it. So if you have your breakfast in Hanoi, you either have this soup that would be your great-grandparents would also have had, or you have French bread. And so as globally there have been all kinds of frozen travels, there have been different shapes. This one I found on the net. It's a Chinese restaurant here in Cologne. I thought I should have something local. And you can see how, I mean, you can write the history, it has been written, of how taste in places like this got reshaped to eat what used to be exotic food, Chinese food. And that became the first food that people in places like this would likely eat from restaurants. Like 80 years ago, there would not be restaurant culture except for the higher middle class. But the Chinese restaurant has both made a restaurant culture and adapted locals to Chinese taste, while in the meantime adapting Chinese food to local taste. And there you see the classic picture of one of the greatest studies on this matter have been written about Coca-Cola. That has spread in the Second World War because the US Army promised all its soldiers that they would get Coca-Cola for 25 cents, close to where they were. So that was a great coalition between the Coca-Cola company and the American state. If ever you want one good one of capitalism and the state working together, it's Coca-Cola. But at the meantime, it also shaped the senses because people in very many places of the world really love their Coca-Cola. I mean, it's not that you can just say this is imperialism or capitalism imposed. People generally like Coca-Cola for all kinds of reasons that with emotional geography you can of course research, but for that they are an interesting fact. So what we have here is the human body that is cultivated by all these complex forms and travels. A human body, very different human bodies, because of course, while for almost everybody globally, and not everybody, but for very many bodies in the world at the moment, you can tell these stories of how their taste and their food get shaped from elsewhere, which actually for many traditional people this is a problem. They're right now losing their traditional foods, and with that lots of their senses of identity. What we can say is that human eating is cultivated, and even if you go to the first stage, you can argue that it's cultivated all the way through. Anybody who's working on eating and food should read the wonderful book of Richard Wrangham, Catching Fire, as its subtitle has, How Cooking Made Us Human. This is a fantastic book, but it's just also fabulously well written and a great story. Wrangham argues that actually the practice of cooking is the moment that so-called apes and monkeys shifted into humans, and that we could have a shorter bowel because with cooking part of the digestion is excorporated. So cooking is digesting. Yeah? So it's the same practice that if you wouldn't cook, you would have to do with your bowels, like making food more easily available to be incorporated in the body. It's partly done in the cooking. And of course then there's agriculture, and agriculture is a massive way to, in all kind of ways, to change so-called nature and to cultivate it, not just by saying, how to say this, actually growing grain and then eating it, but also adapting the grain to what you might want to eat, adapting the fruits to what is more easy to digest. So my body, I've stated on my argument, is cultivated as it incorporates cultivated food. There's too much there, I'm sorry about that. And my argument would then also be that there is no such thing as the bare body. There are these discussions, theoretical discussions about how there would be a bare body on the one hand and a political body built on top of it. Agamben type of discussions, for those who don't know that. And of course, in the context where this argument is made, it's made for good reasons and to defend people's political rights. I don't want to say anything to that. But my argument is that there is not first something as a bare body, because as soon as people eat, they're tied up with all kind of social and technical processes that have involved other kind of people. Eating has been organized as collective all the way through. Hence, my body is also cultivated in that it gets sensitized to different food and drink. So now we come to the senses. What is done in all kind of practices is cultivate senses. And they get cultivated in different ways by different eating practices. And I've made a list of things cultivated here. Sensations, taste, textures, smells, colors, pleasures, and feelings. And I don't make this list to close it down, but to open it up. And to say, as soon as you start to study feelings of emotions, it's good to realize that you don't have to copy a list. It's just part of these lists. Anyway, I see you writing there. Do whatever. But it's not a sort of fixed list. I could make it twice as long or 3 times as long if that wouldn't make the slide unreadable. These various kinds of sensitivities are not separate from one another, but get co-trained and co-chased. And it's interesting to attend to the way, let's say, so-called bodily sensations like touch and so-called emotional sensations like touch flow over into each other and co-constitute each other. There's no such thing as separate emotional feeling in most practices. And this also goes for the way senses get cultivated in all kind of other ways. And what is important there is I think, and I would like to stress, as senses, both so-called on the bodily side and on the so-called emotional side and on this whole fluid in between that, get trained, that it's feeling is not a natural given thing. Feeling is something people learn to practice or do not learn to practice. And we learn this also in some of the ethnographic fieldwork that in my group people are doing. What becomes clear is how there are very many people who come into care practices who do not feel. Now, if you have a general theory of feeling, or who have trouble feeling, or who have trouble tasting their food because they, I mean, that's the story that gets made up in the care practice, because they have been beaten up as a child, so they have learned to not feel, but then they also do not feel their food. So one type of feeling may block or facilitate the other. And you have not for nothing, I mean, that's the woman who has been hit and who has lived under violence will relate to eating differently, or will relate to other types of feeling differently. These kind of sensations may be trained together, tend to be trained together. It's not for nothing that many people globally at the moment are practicing yoga, which is a very specific technique of feeling, which again proves that feeling is not naturally given. Why would people spend so much energy in learning this specific kind of feeling if it was naturally given? It is something that can be trained. And eating the apple in itself. Now, what is relevant there is that the kinds of words I flag up here are words that may be used by researchers, but are words that are also used in all kind of daily life practices. And there is an important task there, I think, and it's to realize that in the cultivation of just about anything, but certainly also feelings, words are part of the cultivation techniques. It's not just bread that makes people learn to taste bread, or it's not just Coca-Cola that makes Coca-Cola practices. It's also the word sweet, or whatever word will be locally used, that goes into making the sensitivities. So whether you say pain or hurt, or whether you say emotion or feeling, is not just, let's say, a theoretical choice. It's also something that is done as part of practices and shifts with practices. And this is a fairly, I mean, I say this longer than I had it on the slides, partly in reflection to what I did yesterday. I think there is a dilemma here for fields that want to study, well, actually whatever, but certainly also emotions. To which extent you try to coin words from the outside that you think are truly what an emotion is, or what a feeling is, or what pain is, or to which extent you get yourself sensitized to words that are being used in the field you happen to study, and see what follows from them, why they are used and what their effects are, and abstain from imposing external theories, especially about the very question you're interested in. Good. So that's my last term there, wording, and I think wording is not just something we do, it's something being done in all the practices being studied, and might be something to include in our studies. Now my big promise, my big jump to the promised political theory. Now in the tradition of political theory there was, as you will all have remarked, it's not very, how to say it, surprisingly there was a suspicion of anything to do with feeling. And that also comes back in the way political theory helps to inform all kind of practices. I see Martin laughing at my, yeah, that's all right. I mean, this is a typical two iconic images of how you can relate as, or how public health relates to the problem of what they see as a problem, or public health sees as a problem of overweight and obesity on the rise in very many countries, which is that in the iconic sort of division both of public health and of political theory, the whole idea is that that there is such a thing as a consumer who is endlessly greedy, that's the first icon, and that there would be a rational citizen who can count and control. And of course the most recent way you can count and control is by having a calorie app on your iPhone, and with that you would be supposed as a rational citizen to control your calorie intake. Now I could unpack that, it's one of my favorite enemies. Yeah, because if we go back to the, we've been working with people who work with people who themselves want to lose weight, indeed finding out that the more you calculate, the less you feel, and the more you will make yourself hungry, and the more likely you are to overeat as soon as you get a chance. So that partly this whole image of the beastly consumer and the rational citizen, when it works in the case of overweight, has exactly the opposite effect of what it achieves to be, rather than training sensitivities and training in cooking or having access to eating, etc. and so on. But I wanted to use it on this occasion also as an icon for how political theory works with this whole idea that on the one hand we have a greedy consumer, we are a greedy consumer, and on the other hand we are, or should be at least, a rational citizen. Now, that type of political theory has inspired all kind of politics, and I give you here an icon of the late 70s and the early 80s that was used in the Netherlands to advocate the boycott of outspun oranges. And this was a very forceful image made by a then South African exile who lived in the Netherlands, who claimed that eating or he not alone of course, claimed that eating outspun oranges was like squeezing a South African, and they are called here blood oranges. The Dutch is bloedsinusappels, they're called blood oranges, and what is underneath is don't squeeze out a South African. This image was actually retrospectively deemed to have been part of what's quite effective. I mean, outspun oranges were banned out of Dutch supermarkets and shops, more or less, I mean, to a very serious extent. But so this is a great, I mean, in my opinion, a good political action. But what is intellectually for now interesting is that what it does is appeal to the rational citizen, or appeal to a citizen to no longer want her or his own bodily pleasures, orange, but to but to restrict himself or herself. If you look at food politics now, it has come in a very different set of political, it works with a very different set of figures. Because this moment, if we're called upon to engage in food politics, it's no longer to abstain from stuff. We're encouraged to eat stuff. And we're encouraged to eat organic stuff and fair trade stuff, for instance. That would be political goodies. And what the message there is have pleasure and a good cause at the same time. So enjoy your lovely milk. And you see this whole icon of all this, you see the flowing lovely hair there. This is on a Dutch organic package. Enjoy it, but at the same time you care for the meadows and the cows. And that one is an image actually from a fair trade chocolate company. So it is, as a Western consumer from whom these kind of images are directed, or a Northern consumer, I should say, in this case, you're also supposed to feel for, empathy with, or direct with the Guyanese woman who's harvesting very happily, luckily, cocoa beans. So this is a different kind of images of of oppression and what did I say? And having to be rational. It is appealing to what you could call good taste and be sensitive to others, and to others in a wide case, other human beings and other creatures. So what kind of social theory do we have? We have, on the one hand, a social theory of being critical and taking distance, and on the other hand, we have also as social theorists that same model that organic and fair trade users are using at this moment, where we as scholars could also take cultivation, this kind of cultivation, become sensitive, let's say, to producers, or become sensitive to the meadows, as a model for our own type of work, where sensitivity could be cultivated and good taste could be cultivated. Now this is very scary for many social scientists, because they have learned about good taste through Bourdieu, and good taste is bad because it's what bourgeoisie has. But it's interesting to think about how good taste can be revitalized as a positive truth, at a moment where you would say that things that you could be rationally critical of, you could also discuss by saying, that's bad taste. What follows? What is productive there? And I'm not celebrating that as the only new model. I'm questioning how cooking, caring, and contributing might not just be interesting objects to research, but also interesting models to think with for the kind of work we are doing. So you can take distance, or you can foster links, connections, folds, analogy, and resonances. And then comes the most important word, contrast. Because in all this work, it won't do to just say, this is going on here. It gives much more dynamic to the kind of work we do. To compare what is going on in one site and contrast it with what is going on in another site. To thereby not pin down the world in one of its versions, but to show different possibilities and have frictions to think with. So what would be the goods and bad of this, and what would be the goods and bad of that? What kind of frictions can we find? All of which would be a way to craft geographies, but also what we could call corporeographies or sensio-geographies. And one of my big puzzles in some of the summaries that I've been reading is why you still call that word geography, except from the fact that that happens to be the department you're in, which might be good enough reason, don't get me wrong. But what is the difference between a geography, a corporeography, and a sensiography, and when to write what, and how to also link them up, and to situate the kind of bodies that might, and the kind of emotions in the work, in geographies, and what kind of geos would that be? Good luck with that. Thank you.